Good afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today to focus on the human rights situation on the margin in Russia, today on the margins of the 48th session of the Human Rights Council. I'm Rachel Denber. I'm Deputy Director for Europe and Central Asia at Human Rights Watch, and I am joined by an extremely distinguished panel who I will introduce as they are about to speak. The aim of our discussion today is to give you a picture of what the human rights situation is today in Russia in the wake of the recent parliamentary elections that took place on September 19th. With the developments of recent months in Russia, new repressive legislation, the arrest of one of Russia's top opposition figures, Alexei Navalny, the landscape for civil society has utterly transformed. And some of the more radical steps to transform civil society by the government were taken in the lead up to these elections. These legislative changes and other measures build on almost a decade of legislative restrictions on civil society. Now, many observers have opined in recent months that the restrictions aim to prevent certain candidates from participating in the elections, like, for example, Mr. Navalny and his supporters, and that they aim to mute criticism of the authorities at a sensitive time, and to intimidate people from expressing or mobilizing any kind of discontent or criticism in the aftermath of the vote. That may be true, but what's also true is that these latest rounds of legislative changes, this latest round of repression, now that the election is over, the laws are still there, and the restrictions are possibly setting a precedent. No one has a crystal ball and can say just what the post-election environment will bring for human rights in Russia, but it's important to talk about the longer-term implications, and that's what we're here to do today with our distinguished panelists. We're also here to talk about what this dramatic deterioration means for the Human Rights Council. I mean, obviously, it merits discussion at the Human Rights Council. Member states came together several months ago for an unprecedented joint statement on Russia in March, and special procedures of the Council have repeatedly expressed dismay about developments. But we need to talk about what else the Human Rights Council can do. So with that, I'd like to turn the floor immediately over to the first of our very distinguished panelists. I'd like to introduce Anna Dobrovolskaya, who is the executive director of the Memorial Human Rights Center, one of Russia's most prominent human rights groups. Anna, at the heart of this massive wave of repression is the foreign agents law. I'd like for you to maybe talk about how this law has a vast range of meanings. I'd like you to talk about maybe how this has affected Memorial, how it's affected other human rights groups. Do people avoid Memorial now that it's been registered as a foreign agent? Are there other methods that the authorities are using to stifle human rights work? And also, I'm hoping, Anna, that you can talk about the fact that Memorial is the leading Russian organization that actually keeps a catalog of political prisoners in Russia. I wonder if you could say a few words about the trends that Memorial is seeing in politically motivated prosecutions in Russia.
Thank you, Rachel.
Anna, I just
yes.
One housekeeping thing I forgot to mention. Ladies and gentlemen, this webinar is being recorded, and we have translation. You can just look to the little translation tab at the bottom or top of your devices for translation into Russian or English. Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, dear colleagues, for having me here to speak at the webinar. My name is Anna Dobrovolskaya. I work at the Memorial Human Rights Center. It's an NGO which is the part of International Memorial Society, and we focus ourselves on the human rights violations that are happening at the moment, while our colleagues from other memorials groups, they focus their work on the remembrance of the Soviet repressions and the human rights violations that were taking part in the past. Indeed, the law on foreign agent is a very important concept at the moment, and it's very important for everyone in Russia. I think there is nobody who did not hear this word, and it's very important to say that maybe in some countries the words foreign agent can be considered as a joke or as an irony. In Russia, this and post-Soviet countries where similar discussions about introducing the same laws also taking place. The foreign agent concept goes way back into the Soviet Union when the Soviet government was very successful while raising the particular level of hysteria around looking for the enemies inside the state. So the whole foreign agent concept, it's not just something very funny, but it's actually deep rooted in our historical memory. That's why it is so efficient and at the same time so dangerous. The law itself was introduced in 2012, and first it was aimed only to make a list of non-governmental organizations which receive foreign funding and which perform political activity. What is the definition of political activity? Nobody knows, but basically it was said that political activity is whatever you say publicly and which may influence the or which speaks about the public policy or government behavior. At the beginning, it was almost like nothing, just a label, but later more and more limitations and further definitions came into place. At the moment, if your organization is as a foreign agent, you cannot cooperate with schools and universities. You cannot nominate people to join the public observation commissions which go to the prisons. You basically cannot talk to well, you can talk to government bodies, but you can not be official partner of the governmental bodies. And for some organizations it's really bad, because a lot of us were working, for example, with the lawyers or with judges or with prosecutors, so none of that is no longer possible for the foreign agent. A lot of organizations managed to either adapt or they killed the legal entities that have been included to the foreign agent list and started registering something else. And that was the way outcome strategy for many organizations and groups. But then the whole concept started developing. Then we, I think it was a couple of years ago when we had the first list of media foreign agents or individual media foreign agents, which basically means that if you're a blogger or a public person, public speaker, and you receive some kind of foreign money as a contract or as a payment for your services, and you do some kind of political public activity, you can be included to this list. And currently we have very many independent journalists or staff members who used to be working in independent media are included to this list of individual media foreign agents or just individual foreign agents. And from NGO authorities also have moved themselves to prosecuting the media as foreign agents, and a lot of very prominent independent media projects have been recently enlisted as foreign agents. Actually, this summer and autumn, we rediscovered the term Black Friday, because for maybe a couple of months, every Friday, authorities announced a new adjustment, a new adding to the foreign agent list, and it's very it's quite already funny, but which is rather sad than funny to expect like who can be included to this list in the next Friday. One of the again recent developments was the introduction of foreign agent for non-registered groups, and the first member for this category was a very again prominent human rights initiative, Golos, which is dealing with the rights of voters and is basically the leading initiative who monitors all the falsifications of the elections. So it was really well connected to what was happening during the election. My organization was included to the foreign agent list in 2014. We have been working ever since. I have to say that we are one of the largest registered organization in Russia, and that's why probably it was not as drastic for us as it could be for smaller organizations. A lot of small organizations, especially those working in the region, had to close because being a foreign agent means that you have to report to authorities 4 times a year. You have to undergo very detailed inspections from the government, and you basically we never feel safe. This is like another peculiarity of this legislation and some other legislations that are currently being used by the against the civil society in Russia, is that we never know when we cross the line and already violate the law on foreign agent. For example, being a foreign agent means that we have to publicly announce that we are enlisted as agents, and we have to put it on our brochures, on the leaflets, on every printed materials. We also have to put it on our website, not just on the website, but to make sure that whoever opens any page or any documents which is on our website have to see that here is this disclaimer saying that here we are and here you are like reading the very dangerous information about human rights violations from the foreign agent. But like the one of the recent developments for Memorial and some other organizations was that we also had to mark all our social media and all our other public domains in internet, and well, it became like the new development to the law, the new amendment, and you know about this new amendment. Sometimes you know about it in advance, but sometimes you only realize that something changed when you already receive a fine or a protocol about administrative violations from one of the governmental bodies, and that's what basically happened with us. It makes this law a very perfect instrument, not only for smear campaigns against human rights defenders, but also for creating the atmosphere when we constantly have to monitor ourselves, have to check what we do, what we speak, what we say, and how we communicate with others. It had, of course, an effect on the people who come to our services. Fortunately or unfortunately, people who come to Memorial to seek legal aid are usually at a very desperate situation, and most of the times they do not care that we are foreign agents, but in many situations, of course, they prefer to go somewhere else, especially if the situation is happening in Northern Caucasus, where this concept is even more dangerous than elsewhere. And recently we started having subcontractors who say that we completely support your work. We know that you are a great NGO, but we cannot receive money directly from you. So we will have to find some other ways of supporting your work or providing some services for you. And yeah, basically right now we are in the situation when almost everyone understands that the concept is very ironic and very funny, so to say, and people know that being a foreign agent is sometimes a very honorable sign, that if you are enlisted as an agent, that probably means that you are doing something great. At the same time, the risks are very high, especially the risks for the people to be enlisted as individual foreign agents, and that's one of the very dangerous concepts that is being currently developed. You probably you can Google this very famous petition, which was launched about I think a couple of weeks ago by independent media project Over the Info in Russia, and it was the petition to completely ban the law on foreign agent and like to have it removed. It very quickly gained more than 150,000 of signatures, which means that society is very, like civil society is very tired of this idea, and basically a lot of people are supporting its removal from the legal sphere, but at the same time it remains, and unfortunately we see a very wide range for possible applications of it against independent journalists and civil society and human rights defenders. I'm running out of my time, but I hope there will be some room for the discussion later, where I can talk about some other trends. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you very much, Anna, for that grim overview. Indeed, these laws really are intended to make people aware that you never know where as you said, you never know when you'll be stepping over the line, and just about anybody can be declared a foreign agent these days. I'd now like to turn the floor over to Ivan Pavlov, who is a very distinguished human rights lawyer in Russia, one of Russia's top human rights lawyers, and who was the head of the former Team 29, which was a collective of human rights lawyers and journalists. And Ivan, I'm hoping that you can talk about how the authorities have used another law to stop dissent, and that's the law in Russia, and that's the law on undesirable foreign organizations, which bans foreign groups that are allegedly undermine Russia's security and defense, constitutional order and the like. And maybe you can talk about how this law affected you and affected Team 29. Two other things I'm hoping you might talk about is the fact that you were counsel for Alexei Navalny and his movements in the lawsuit that authorities have pressed against his groups to ban them as extremists. We're wondering if you could say a few words about that. And then finally, you are one of Russia's top human rights lawyers, and the authorities pressed bogus criminal charges against you. And some observers, me included, saw this as something quite unprecedented, even for Russia, to press criminal charges against a human rights lawyer. So maybe you can, if there's time, you can talk about whether this kind of is the kind of pressure human rights lawyers in Russia that are facing today. Is that changing? Thank you, Ivan, and the floor is yours.
Добрый день, Rachel. Спасибо.
Hello, Rachel. Thank you. Thank you for introducing me. Thank you to organizers who made it possible for me to be able to speak today at such a high-level event. Right now, what Anna have told us reminded me the times when in Russia we just started with first repressive laws towards organizations, the laws on foreign agents. It was 2014 when first organizations were put on the list of foreign agents. In order to reach this cooling effect for all the non-commercial sector of organizations, first of all, they called most well-known organizations foreign agents. After some time, I called the law on foreign agents most effective way of destroying the civil society in Russia, because it practically paralyzed activities of the organizations that were put on the list of foreign agents. Most of their work was devoted to defending themselves against extra penalties, searches, checkups, not defending the values that they were created to defend. Those organizations, they were not on the list of foreign agents yet. Under this cooling effect, were forced to a big extent to limit their activities, to refuse some projects that could cause extra attention to them from authorities. Later, they realized that this also is not helping because there are no clear rules. You could be on the list for any past activities or for some publicly announced opinion by one of the workers of the organization. At that time, we considered it awful times which could not get worse. Right now, we definitely see it can get worse in those times. In 2014, we are remembering with a certain nostalgic feeling. First of all, the law on foreign agents each year is becoming better and better. And from professional point of view, I can tell you that now this legislation is implemented to only 50%. Its potential is huge, and consequences of using it probably can scare even ideologists and creators of this legislation itself. Maybe it's a blocking factor that somebody is still pushing some brakes. Also, we have even more repressive legislation, which of undesirable organizations. According to the law, undesirable organizations could be only foreign organizations, The law itself is aimed primarily to the Russian citizens. And in this case, we have a different legal status of organization of undesirable and foreign agents. The practice shows that with the status of foreign agent, organization can still survive in Ukraine. With the status of being undesirable organization, you will be able to live in Russia only in prison. Any connection of Russian citizen with undesirable organization is absolutely forbidden. And for that, you have administrative and criminal charges. The legislation is formed that criminal charges could be applied even for the repost of some information, and they don't have to prove anything. They just have to mention the state security. That's what happened to Team 29. It was considered that we are publishing materials of undesirable organizations, and it created risk of repression, not only for the members of Team 29, but also for all our supporters, those who gave us some donations, who was reposting our materials. So the risk went far beyond our team and covered big number of people who supported us. This forced us to adopt a difficult decision to close Team 29 and all its media resources. Third, we still have another repressive legislation which continues blooming. It's extremism legislation. I would call it the mass destruction weapon, because unlike the foreign agent legislation and undesirable organization, this legislation is not hitting certain points. It hits everyone. Anybody can be attacked by this legislation because it's applied not only by state security agencies, but also police, regular police. And we know how police is working in our country. They use the sticks and they ensure this way, their way upwards in their career. Of course, the authorities are using this mechanism, the legal extremism laws as well. And Alexei Navalny case as an anti-corruption case also is a good example. And it created problems for many people who supported it. Of course, if we put all people to prisons, it will create too many political difficulties for the authorities, so they are squeezing out those they don't like out of the country. So we see people leaving the country in groups, in whole organizations as a result of this politics. So if we used to have steamers, now we have planes with journalists, and maybe we will see trains with the lawyers soon. My story, I will probably not tell right now. My time is running out. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. Just a reminder, everybody, that just quite recently, September 17th, a human rights defender, Ilya, Igor Kalyapin, was fined 10,000 rubles for violating the law on undesirable foreign organizations because of an alleged link on his organization's website. So that's the first, right now, that's the first offense, and it's an administrative offense. But if he is found to commit a second offense within 12 months, then it goes right to criminal. He could be held criminally accountable. That's Igor Kalyapin, who's the head of the Committee Against Torture, a Russian group that documents torture. So now we're turning to, it's my great honor to introduce Svetlana Zakharova, who is the director of Sphere, a humanitarian group that supports lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people in Russia, and is the a partner with the LGBT network, one of Russia's top LGBT support groups. And Svetlana, since at least 2013, the authorities have been using homophobia for blatant political ends, something we see in sadly, something we're seeing now in other countries as well in the region. How is this affecting people who identify as LGBTQ in Russia? Maybe you can talk about what kinds of threats and risks people who are identifying as LGBTQ face in Russia, and are there places where these threats are more acute than others? Svetlana, thank you so much for joining. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and thank you, Ivan and Anna, for this comprehensive analysis of the challenges we all face in Russia. Indeed, LGBT organizations, groups, and individuals face the same threats, and Charitable Foundation Sphere, my organization, is also in the list of foreign agents since 2016. And we have quite a lot of difficulties with funding because of the legislation on undesirable organizations. And I know that right now, quite many people thinking if it's actually safe for them to work with us or to donate us money or even to participate in our events. Taking about situation with LGBT rights in Russia, I believe that everyone in this room have heard many times that Russia is a homophobic country. But what exactly does it mean? For me, it means that one group, one social group, namely LGBT+, is considered not equal to all other citizens. And Rachel, you mentioned this legislation, the so-called propaganda law. Basically, this legislation says that it is forbidden to propagate non-traditional sexual relations among minors. But the problem is the same. One of the problems is the same as many other parts of the Russian legislation. The law does not specify what exactly propagate means, and it gives a huge opportunity for all kinds of interpretations and decisions. To be honest, this legislation, so-called propaganda law, is applied rarely. I do not think that the goal was really to apply it, to use it a lot, but the goal was to silence LGBT+ community and the rest of the population. Each case when this law is applied is widely discussed in the mass media, and it gives a very specific sign to members of LGBT community. You are not going to be protected by the law and you have no rights in this country. I believe that this legislation was created not to protect children, as it was stated, but to create an enemy. And basically, children and youth in Russia are far more sophisticated than authorities expected. Several years ago, there was a public poll, and youth were asked all kinds of questions, including questions about LGBT. And it turned out that at least half of them are already in favor of marriage equality, and more than 80% actually are fine with LGBT. But despite of this quite progressive, I would say, vision of the youth, the situation with LGBT+ community is really far from being perfect or even good. As I said, this legislation is not used often, but it creates this, for the perpetrators, it creates the feeling that they're doing right things, that there are authorities behind them. And for LGBT community, it makes us feel targeted, vulnerable, and unprotected. I just would like to mention several consequences for the community of the application of this law. First of all, open public discussions about LGBT are absolutely impossible. Right now in St. Petersburg, Queer Fest is taking place. It is a festival of queer culture. And even so, only those who are over 18 can attend the events of this festival. Basically, the organizers facing threats, facing very special attention of the law enforcement agencies, and venues refuse to provide spaces at the very last moment. And in Russia, it usually means that there was some calls from above. Another one example is constant attempts of the police and other law enforcement agencies to block LGBT-related resources. This is something that's happening for all the time since the adoption of this law, and since for the first time the project Children 404 was attacked. And by now I believe that it's hard to find any LGBT-related resource group or organizations that never faced it. And our resources, I think there were at least 5 attempts to block them for the just last several years. Another big problem I can see is the fact that LGBT minors do not get support from teachers and social workers. Teachers and social workers are afraid that they can be punished under this legislation, and as a result, they prefer to turn blind eye when there is a minor who needs support. And I can tell you more. Last year, we conducted research devoted to the bullying of LGBT minors at schools. And it turned out that in Russia, teachers and social workers quite often support bullying or even initiate it. And for me, it is just the result of this official line. Another big problem, and of course, I cannot not mention that, is hate crimes. The number of hate crimes against LGBT plus in Russia is growing, and the police quite often refuse to investigate those crimes properly. Several years ago, a 17-year boy was beaten and dropped because of his sexual orientation, and he went to the police with his mother. And at the police office, he was said that basically he was beaten for reason, meaning his sexual orientation, and that police do not protect people like him because there is a propaganda law. Of course, there is nothing like that in the legislation itself, but this is how it is used. And of course, the extreme case and extreme example of hate crimes is something that is going on in Chechnya. In 2017, the whole world learned that people, LGBT plus people in Chechnya, are being killed, detained, tortured, just because of their sexual orientation and gender identity. Since 2017, our emergency support team was contacted by more than 500 people. More than 300 people were taken out of the region, and more than 250 people found sanctuary outside of Russia. But despite of all the evidences, despite of the Vienna mechanism and Moscow mechanism, there is no proper attention and no proper investigation of this situation on behalf of the Russian federal authorities. They still are saying that there is nothing like mass persecution of LGBT plus community in Chechnya. This June, Halimat Taramova contacted the hotline of the Russian LGBT network, and she said that her life is in danger because of her sexual orientation. She managed to flee from Chechnya by herself, and she was staying in the shelter in Makhachkala, and she was waiting for the relocation to a safer space. But a few days later, the shelter was attacked by the law enforcement agencies. And even so, she was of age. And even so, she clearly stated that she left her parents' house on her own will. She was detained and taken back to Chechnya. She was that much scared that she tried to commit suicide during the detention. This is only one case of what is happening in Chechnya, but it clearly shows that in Russia, law enforcement agencies not only do not protect its citizens, but also participate in the all atrocities and severely violate human rights. Thank you. I will stop here and will be happy to answer all questions.
Thank you, Svetlana, for that grim overview. It really is astounding that that in Russia, not only is there politically mobilized homophobia, but people, and I guess it's not surprising, can't get justice and protection for these kinds of just blatant crimes. Okay, we're going to turn the floor over now to Natalia Zviagina, who is the director of Amnesty Moscow office. Natalia, Amnesty International has done extensive documentation about all of the repressive laws and other trends. All right, I think the host just muted me. So I will just turn the floor over to you without further introduction.
Okay, I can give some examples of concrete people to face some charges because of mentioned legislation on foreign agent and undesirable organizations. For example, entrepreneur Mikhail Iosilevich was spending for 6 months in jail for allegedly providing a meeting space for the training for independent election observers. But local authority decided this observers group related to one of the undesirable organization Open Russia, and this guy was released during the last election campaign, but he still faces 4-year imprisonment for almost for nothing. Or the second example, this is the former director of Open Russia, Andrei Pivovarov. He's a politician, and his organization, Open Russia, was closed officially before the election, and then he promised to run his candidature during the State Duma election. But of course, he is in pretrial detention on the same charges for sharing a Facebook post about local election, which authority claim promoted activities of an undesirable organization. Actually, not only Igor Kalyapin, who was mentioned by my colleagues, but also Alexei Glukhov, human rights defender from Chelyabinsk. He works for Apologia Protesta also. He faced a lot of accusation because some publication in his Facebook account on undesirable organizations also. This is very difficult for activists. Many of my colleagues decided just delete their Facebook accounts, for example, to avoid such kind of accusations. I would like to mention one more case. This is not related to foreign agent or to undesirability, but this case is very important and very symptomatic for current situation, where we can say no one criticism can be welcomed publicly. For example, I mean, Shaman Alexander Gabyshev from Far East region, Republic Sakha-Yakutia. Gabyshev announced his walk from Siberia to Moscow in 2018. He promised to use his shamanic power to purge President Vladimir Putin from Kremlin. And finally, he has been repeatedly and arbitrarily arrested. And last week, Republican court approved the decision to confine him to a psychiatric hospital. And of course, not only human rights defenders and political activists face some accusation because of foreign agent law and undesirability, but also media can be nominated as foreign agent. And actually, media community, journalist community inspires me for the last Duma election campaign period, because they organized joint statement against foreign agent. They also organized public rally to attract attention to this problem. And there are a lot of people who were nominated as a foreign agent personally, media and person as foreign agent and media. This is also a very important moment. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you, Natalia, for that overview. I am now going to give the floor to Ilya Nuzov, who is the head of the Eastern Europe and Central Asia desk for the International Federation for Human Rights. Ilya, your organization recently published a report about a very specific impact of the foreign agents and other repressive legislation in Russia today. And so maybe you can say a few words about that.
Yes, thank you very much, Rachel. I'm very happy to co-organize this event. Before I do turn to this very specific issue, I'd like to, if you permit me, say a couple of words about the elections. I think we'd be remiss not to say anything about these so-called elections that just took place. And specifically, I would like to make 2 points. The anti-extremism law that colleagues referred to earlier bans people involved in the activities of outlawed extremist or terrorist organizations from running in elections at all levels. And that law was expressly put in place in June 2021 to bar political opponents from participating in elections. in addition to being vague and arbitrary, the law applies to activities that took up place up to 1 year before the designation of organization as extremist or terrorist. I think in this sense, it's quite an innovative piece of legislation because if we regard disqualification from elections as punishment, this law violates the prohibition of punishment for activities that were not illegal at the time they took place. And that is not only a violation of Russia's constitution, Article 54, but is also a violation of a general principle of international law, which is also part of Russia's legal system under Article 15 of the Constitution, which nobody yet abolished. And just very briefly, to give an overview of the whole range of violations of election standards that were violated on September 17th, and besides arrests and disqualification of opposition politicians, independent observers recorded over 5,000 violations of election laws, including ballot stuffing, carousel voting, forced voting, and the banning of monitors, independent monitors, from observing the election process. But September 17 marked not only the beginning of these sham elections. On this day, we also commemorated the 1939 Soviet Union's invasion of Poland, following the signing of the secret protocol to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which partitioned Poland between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. On that day this year, the Russian MFA tweeted that on September 17, 1939, the Soviet Union began its liberation campaign in Poland. And this lie forms part of the regime's main ideological pillar, the victory of the Soviet Union in the Second World War. According to this historical narrative, which the regime uses to legitimize itself, Russia positions itself as a successor of the USSR, which liberated the world from the Axis powers, downplaying or denying responsibility for any crimes the USSR might have committed during its occupation of Poland and the Baltic states, such as the Katyn war crime or the deportation of the peoples of the Baltics to the gulags. And in this narrative, which is now enshrined in the constitutional provision prohibiting the diminishing of Russia's military achievements, there's no place for victims of Stalinist atrocities or other Soviet crimes. The Russian regime obsessively regulates this historical narrative, committing violations of human rights of historians, journalists, lawyers, activists, NGOs, all of those who speak out for victims of Soviet-era crimes or who challenge these historical lies in courts, such as individuals and organizations represented here. And I'm speaking about the Memorial and Komanda Team 29. In its recent report, Russia Crimes Against History, FIDH compiles all restrictive legislation and repressive acts that aim to stifle these independent voices and analyzes them in terms of human rights law, international human rights law. I'm just going to show the report here, but I'll post the link to it in the chat following my presentation. These repressive acts include at least 7 so-called memory laws restricting freedom of expression, such as the recent amendments to the law on exoneration of Nazism, which criminalizes publicly equating the role and actions of the Soviet and Nazi leadership during the Second World War, or minimizing the Soviet Union's role in the victory in the Second World War. It is now prohibited to denigrate the memory of veterans of the Second World War, a provision that was used to prosecute Alexei Navalny, with violators risking up to 5 years in prison. The original formulation of the law prohibiting exoneration of Nazism criminalizes the dissemination of knowingly false information about the Soviet Union's activities during World War II and the insult to symbols of military glory. Meanwhile, access to archives of repressive state organs dating back to World War II or even earlier is severely restricted. NGOs, as has been stated repeatedly, face increased scrutiny, fines, and liquidation as a consequence of the likes of foreign agent law, undermining freedom of association. In addition, historians or activists face threats, intimidation, with the effect of chilling their freedom of expression. Some have been expelled, others forced to leave Russia. Some, like Yuri Dmitriev, have been subjected to arbitrary arrest and detention, and he's currently serving 13 and a half years in prison. And the victims of Soviet-era repressions, to the extent that there are still some of those survivors, are not offered adequate reparations for the harms they suffered, which are guaranteed by both international and domestic law. And I'm referring, of course, to this case of the children of Gulag, their right to come back to the homes from which their parents have been expelled. So in short, our report makes it clear the link between manipulation of historical memory and human rights abuses. And it highlights one simple truth, that a regime that does not recognize human rights abuses of its predecessor is bound to repeat them. So again, you can find a report available in Russian, English, and French on our website. Thank you for your attention. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ilya. Thank you, Ilya. Now, our last speaker is Matt Jones, who is International Advocacy Officer for Human Rights House, one of the co-sponsors of today's event. Matt, I think that you will round up this conversation by talking about what it is that we can ask the Human Rights Council to do, what we should be asking the Human Rights Council to do, given the deterioration of human rights in Russia, in legislation and in other measures that our panelists have just talked about. Matt, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rachel. And Human Rights House Foundation is very glad to co-sponsor this event, and it's definitely an honor to share the panel with my distinguished colleagues. A couple of very brief comments from me and then some recommendations. First, I think we've heard it's very clear that the human rights situation continues to deteriorate in Russia. Even some of the research that Human Rights House Foundation has conducted with colleagues on the ground in Russia has shown that clearly one of the objectives of the legislation that's being passed in Russia is to try and weaken and destroy relationships, not just within domestic civil society in Russia, but also the links between Russian civil society and the international community, including international civil society. It's really ironic that at the last Human Rights Council session, we saw Russia not just contribute to a resolution on civil society space, but also join the consensus on. And here we hear from colleagues, actually Russia doing precisely the opposite domestically. And that's deeply troubling. And let's also remind ourselves that Russia is a member of the Human Rights Council and therefore subject to a higher degree of scrutiny. So Russia should expect that we have much more scrutiny on its human rights situation just by fact that it is a member of the Human Rights Council now. So I think given what we've heard, I think it's fair to say that it's important now that there is more scrutiny. And I think we're already starting to see that at the Human Rights Council and elsewhere. We saw, Rachel mentioned it at the very beginning, we saw a joint statement co-sponsored by 45 states back in March at the Human Rights Council session, at the 46th session. We've seen a number of different civil society sponsored events this year, really focusing on the deteriorating situation. The High Commissioner for Human Rights has made several statements focused on Russia, quite strong statements, and I'd encourage you to go and look at those statements if you haven't heard or read them yet. We've seen a number of joint statements by UN special procedures citing concern on various elements of the deterioration. And the Secretary General has repeatedly raised legislation restricting civil society space in the reports on reprisals at the UN, including right at the session. So the most recent report of the Secretary General on reprisals identifies deteriorating civil society space and the legislative element as being of serious concern. So I really encourage you to read the Russia-related elements in the Secretary General's most recent report. It's therefore, I think, really important that the Council starts to look at further steps to address this situation. I think we've really passed now a Rubicon and a moment, and it's important that we look forward to what's next. It's important that we ensure greater scrutiny of Russia and its domestic human rights situation across the board in multilateral fora, including not just at the Council, but also for those states who are members of the OSCE and the Council of Europe that use opportunities there for greater scrutiny. I think Russia is very good at avoiding domestic scrutiny, but I think if there is a good faith measure, it could look at allowing country visits of relevant special procedures mandates. And I think that it's important that states are strongly encouraging Russia to accept visits. It comes to mind the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Association and Assembly for over a decade has been requesting visits and has been refused a visit to Russia. Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders never visited. Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression and Opinion never visited. So this would be a good faith measure on the part of Russia. And given that Russia has been now served warning by states, by the international community for many months over its deteriorating situation, I think it's really important that Council members start to seriously look at bringing Russia formally before the Human Rights Council and onto the agenda. And that might take the form of a resolution. I think it's important that we're seeing some objective analysis, whether that's in the form of reporting by the High Commissioner, whether that's a new country mandate focused on Russia. I think it's really now time that the Council seizes this moment and takes Russia seriously on the formal agenda of the Council. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matt. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes the first part of our webinar today. We've now heard from all our panelists. The floor is open to your questions. If you can put them in the Q&A chat box. And while we're waiting for your questions, we have about 8 minutes more left in our allotted time. While we're waiting for your questions, I'm happy to ask one to one of our panelists. I also like to say that state delegation representatives, if you are here, are also invited to make an intervention. Please raise your hands if you would like to do so. I think while we're waiting for our other participants to log in for their into the chat boxes with questions or statements, maybe I can, in the meanwhile, ask a follow-up question. Anna, if it's okay with you, I'd like to ask a follow-up question to you. And it's about, I think during the panel, you didn't have an opportunity to talk about the important work that Memorial does documenting political prisoners in Russia, identifying cases as politically motivated. Memorial is the organization in Russia that is doing the most work on this. Maybe could you say a few words about the dynamics that you're seeing with the motivated prosecutions in Russia today?
Yeah, just a couple of words. Thank you for this question, Rachel. Actually, part of it was already said by Ivan when he said about the anti-extremism legislation. And that's actually one of the trends that authorities are introducing more and more very vague legislative initiatives, which can be used either just to control the people who have different set of mind, or they can be applied very particularly in a series of cases when none of the political activists or just people who have a different opinion, none of them can be safe. And I just shared in the chat the link to our last year's list of political prisoners. We publish small updates we publish every 3 months, but every year on the anniversary of the day of memory of Soviet political prisoners, we publish the annual update, and you will see that this list has very many people who are persecuted due to their religion. And that's the recent and very worrying trend that Jehovah's Witnesses, alongside with various Muslim independent groups, are being persecuted just for being a member of the peaceful initiatives, just to talk about Bible or to talk about Quran. And that's very worrying. We've been raising this issue together with our partners for many years right now, and it's unfortunately continuing to happen. I see that there are some people and countries wishing to speak. So yeah, our website there, and if you would like to answer any questions or would like to receive the updates, please just write on the contacts that you find on our website.
Thank you very much, Anna. We have a request from the state delegation from Poland to take the floor. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Madam, and thank you all the organizers for this very timely event, as we are witnessing a rapidly deteriorating human rights situation in Russia. And we see also the systemic crackdown on opposition voices, human rights defenders, and independent civil society and media. Last week, Duma's elections happened against the backdrop of unprecedented Kremlin's campaign to silence all independent voices in Russia. The right to stand in elections has been severely hindered for all non-systemic opposition candidates as a result of entry into force of new anti-freedom legislative acts. They also severely hampered the ability of Russians to make a choice in accordance with their own preferences. Many cases of electoral fraud have been observed during the elections, including voting several times by the same persons, exchanging vote cards after closing the polling stations, forcing people to vote by their employers. Furthermore, Russia decided to make deployment of the ODIHR election observers mission during the 1790 September ballot impossible. Such actions call into question the intentions of the Russian Federation authorities with regard to respecting democratic values. Unfortunately, today we need to underline that all the above mentioned activities just confirm doubts regarding transparency of the electoral process. Having in mind all these already mentioned circumstances, as well as the fact that Russia's administration continuously refuses to play by the rule of international law and constantly commits violations of human rights, the international community needs to pay much more attention to the human rights landscape in Russia and to ensure a better scrutiny being exercised with regard to this country in the Human Rights Council. Some measures undertaken by the Council have been already raised by previous speakers, but I think that given the rapidly deteriorating human rights situation in Russia, the Human Rights Council should act more decisively and in a better way in order to properly tackle the human rights violation that are being committed on a very large scale in Russia. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I believe that there is also a request from the Czech delegation to speak. If that's correct, then you have the Czech delegation has the floor. Okay. Then I will then turn to a question that's coming through the chat. It's a question, I think, I'll read the question out loud. What do you think should be done to maintain the engagement and cooperation of expelled and undesirable NGOs and editorial staff for democratic development in Russia? What measures are needed? What measures are possible? This is from Stefan Mele. And it's just to repeat, the question is about what can be done to support civil society activists, whether they're human rights defenders or lawyers or journalists who have had to leave Russia for their safety. So I will, let's see, I would like to maybe first ask Anna if she would like to take a stab at that question.
Thank you, Rachel. Just very quickly, I think a lot of actions are being already taken care of by all of our partners, including those who are undesirable organizations, as Stefan himself. I think that it is very important, even now during the COVID times, that European governments and other countries that are able to receive human rights defenders and activists for temporary relocation, that they continue to issue visas, because right now it's been a very problematic situation because of COVID restrictions. It's very complicated to get a visa, and there are very few countries who are willing to do that, notwithstanding all their circumstances. And right now, a lot of people are living to some of the post-Soviet countries, which are good, but it's not always the safe space. So we constantly keep calling to especially the countries of European Union to be welcoming those human rights defenders and political activists who have to flee Russia. Then I said I really support the statement of Poland with the Polish delegation, with what was said to call on the particular actions from Russian side. And I think it is crucially important that we as an international civil society keep demonstrating that there are international standards of human rights, and that if a certain country is willing to be a member of the UN, of Council of Europe, of OSCE, this country have to perform at least some actions to go in line with those standards. Otherwise, those international structures become just not very efficient anymore, unfortunately. Yeah, thank you for the floor.
Thank you, Anna. I think that Stefan has asked a really important question, and I would like to ask our other panelists if they have other comments about what can be done to support Russian human rights activists, lawyers, journalists who have had to leave the country for their safety so that they can continue their work and continue to live in safety. If there's any other comments, maybe from Ilya or Ivan or Natalia to complement or add to what Anna has already said. You have the floor if you do.
Well, if I may just very briefly, Rachel, I think that it's just extremely important to continue supporting these activists and human rights defenders. I think that the work continues, even though they have left the country, and often they continue documenting human rights violations or seeking outreach with international organizations, international institutions like the OSCE, the Council of Europe, the UN, of course. And so I think it's important to continue the engagement and support them any way possible. That could include, of course, financing. That could include just facilitating meetings with international interlocutors, international organizations. That could include, as Anna has suggested, advocacy with national authorities to welcome human rights defenders and activists, provide them a safe haven, and help them with emergency relocation, but also, help to deliver their messages to the national authorities if we have the ability to do so, and to the international stakeholders.
Thank you, Ilya. Anna, I see your hand is up. Is there something you would like to add?
I would like to add something, but maybe after some of the speakers. I actually would like to call all of us not to forget about other post-Soviet country, which is Belarus, where the situation with human rights defenders and independent political activists is much worse. And I see, and we all see in Russia, that Putin is meeting Lukashenko, and as soon as they agree on something, we don't know what, immediately we see some harsh actions towards civil society in Russia. And I would like to say that whatever happens in Belarus is being very closely monitored by Russian authorities and by the civil society as well. And if international community fails to help Belarus civil society, the situation for Russian civil society will be even worse. And right now we have lots of colleagues from Vyasna Human Rights Center and from other organizations being imprisoned in Belarus. And that's, for us, we are kind of looking at our future when we look at Belarus, and that's a very scary trend.
And I'm so glad that you brought that up. I think that we have seen in Belarus now just an effort by the government to just completely annihilate civil society. It's quite shocking, the numbers of liquidations of civil society groups, the numbers of people arrested, the numbers of criminal investigations, of raids and the like. it shocks the conscience. And I think one of it has put our colleagues, as you said, in extreme danger and deprived them of their freedom. And it also, I think, serves as a very disturbing precedent because it shows that it can be done. Anna, you said that whenever there's a crackdown in Belarus, the activists in Russia get anxious because you wonder what the next step is going to be in Russia. I think that when Lukashenko has unleashed what he's unleashed in Belarus, it just shows that it can be done. And the next person who tries to unleash that kind of annihilation of civil society, maybe it won't be as shocking to observers because it's been done already. I believe that Natalia had her hand up.
Yes, I proposed to remember not only people who flee country, but also people who made a decision to stay within a country with status, for example, as a person and undesirable, or whether a foreign agent media, and such kind of people need to receive a lot of legal support because there is no clear rules how to provide these reports to tax service, to Ministry of Justice, and at the same time there are very clear punishment measures. So international community can support organizations which provide legal legal advisory, legal assistance for such kind of organization are very important. And there are some of such kind of organization, but maybe there are more resources for such kind of organizations.
Thank you so much, Natalia. Colleagues, we are at the 1 hour mark. I think it's time to wrap up so that we can let delegations get back to the Human Rights Council proceedings. So I just want to then thank every one of you for the work that you do. First of all, to remind everyone of the courage that you have carrying out the work that you're doing in Russia. I want to thank you, Anna, Ivan, Svetlana, Natalia, Ilya, and Matt for your interventions. Thank you to the delegates who have attended this webinar, and thank you to all of our other participants. I'd just like to let everyone know that the full recording will be available shortly on Human Rights House Foundation's YouTube channel. And thank you also to the co-sponsors of this event, Human Rights House Foundation, Amnesty International, and International Federation for Human Rights. So with that, I will close this session and wish you all a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.